not linear in time as it played out, but organized into areas that make some sort of sense together to me. Essentially, this is like that big book that Ralph Edwards used to come out onto the TV screen with, where he'd say, "This is your life, Russell Simpson." And then he would have all sorts of people from your past speak in the background, and then come out and tell you wonderful or embarrassing things. I'm going to have to represent all those people and do the speaking and the embarrassing myself, but I think I'm up to it. I was born in Texas to a family of pioneers. That is to say that everybody was involved with the West and expansion. My father, as a baby, rode in a covered wagon from Oklahoma, where he was born, to Colorado. They crossed the plains by following the wagon ruts from one town to the next because they didn't have roads yet. When they arrived in Colorado, my grandfather, Dexter, founded the town of Kim, Colorado, in a spot where there wasn't any, and then he acted as the postmaster. Kim still exists today with a population of 65. So it has expanded greatly from the original population of 3, since that's a rate of about 2,000%. My grandma Bessie played the piano beautifully by ear. Like her, I love to play music, always have, and I have some ability to play by ear. Now, my mother's parents were homesteaders in Montana. They each had their own separate property, and when they married, my grandpa moved in with my grandma because she had the better land. She had a round-the-year creek that flowed all the year. It was named Froze to Death Creek, after an unfortunate incident one frozen Montana winter. Grandma also ran a hardware store in the town of Ingomar. My mother told us that as she was growing up, one of the neighbors was known to be a horse rustler, but he only rustled horses down in Texas, not locally, so he was acceptable. My grandpa Darwin was away from home for months at a time hunting for dinosaur bones. He was very successful with that. He found many tons of bones from various species of dinosaur. He worked with the famed paleontologist Barnum Brown, and their finds are in the American Museum of Natural History in New York. My mother Vivian grew up on the farm, and she was adventurous. For excitement, she and her friends would drive an automobile atop the railroad tracks. There weren't many trains, and they knew the schedule, I guess. The construction of the Fort Peck Dam nearby drew many young men as workers on it. Young women, therefore, were in great demand. So my mother, who loved to dance, would sometimes be able to go to a dance with 2 different dance partners in the same evening. One would drop her off, and immediately afterward, the other one would pick her up. My dad, Cecil's his name, started on a farm and became the first in his family to ever earn a college degree. It was in mechanicals engineering. He was a good student and was awarded the engineering equivalent for Phi Beta Kappa. My mom and dad met in Denison, Texas, where Grandpa Harbin had moved the family to work on a different dam to create Lake Texoma. This was a site that our extended family would return to for family reunions every year for 50 years. Well, decades anyway, I don't know how many years. There would be as many as 40, 50 people from different states that would show up because we all love to get together. We had strong and have strong family ties. Now, these stories of succeeding through individual effort led me to believe that I too could excel. I think that my choice of a career in science was because in the 1950s and 60s, science was almost worshipped in the United States. So it seemed to be the best choice. I also had a strong interest in music and art, but the prospects weren't as attractive. And I'll mark that it's 10 after the hour, and I'll turn the page on this scribbling, and I've got to keep myself on track, which I'm not reading, but I'm trying to not leave a lot out. So I'm the eldest out of 4 children in our family. We spanned 10 years in all, so it was almost like 2 different groups of 2 children each. My next brother, Darren, and I are very close, almost like brothers. I have become closer to my younger siblings, Steve and Susie, as time has gone on. As the oldest son of the oldest son in our family line, much was expected of me. I excelled academically with all A's once they stopped grading me for conduct. There's a TV show some of you are probably familiar with, known as the Big Bang Theory. And the character in there, Sheldon, is also from a small East Texas town, just as I grew up. And there were some vague similarities. I wasn't near as smart as Sheldon, and I hope I wasn't quite as clueless about social interactions. So I graduated as valedictorian of both junior high and high school, but did not receive a college scholarship that was sponsored by my father's firm. I was disappointed by that, and it changed my life, or more accurately, I changed my life in response. I determined that I would become a different person. I was disappointed at trying academically very hard, and so I decided I wouldn't continue to do that. Now I have to plug this phone in, and you'll have to tell me, somebody who can talk can tell me if you can still see me.
Now we can see you.
Yeah, well, that was when the power went down, and this is where the problem comes in, that I may have to turn upside down, but let's try it. So believe it or not, I'm sort of balancing on a cord. Where was I? I was about to become a different person. So as a freshman at Rice University, where I went to college, I decided to call myself Russ, R-U-S, with one S, because I decided that if you already had a sibling, why did you need 2? I was Russ for many years, not the Russell, which I had been named at birth. Now, I'd never drunk a beer while I was in high school, but I was on the beer chugging team as a freshman in college. That was a change. Curious of what it would be like to be hungry, I fasted for a week. Now that started off difficult because I was very hungry, and I was obliged to serve meals to the upperclassmen because I was a freshman. So it was hard to sit there not eating with an empty plate while young men were all around me enjoying the food. I hope I'm back. This balancing on a wire is trickier than it looks. No, not eating. So after about 3 days, the hunger pangs went away. So I continued to fast, and after a week, after 7 days, I had noticed that I still wasn't hungry, but I was getting weaker and weaker. So that scared me, and I broke my fast. So I learned what it was like to be hungry, which I'd never been hungry in my life. And I have to say, I haven't been very hungry since either. It's not fun. I don't envy the people that have no choice. Blah, 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 eating, not eating. One of the most interesting courses I took at Rice University was in sports. I'd never been good at sports because I was started a year ahead of, I started school a year ahead of my age group. So I was always smaller and slower, etc. But at Rice, this was great because there were a lot of nerds there. And so I was able to hold my own playing sports with all the other nerds. And I learned to really love a couple of them. Racquetball in particular, except it hadn't been invented yet. It was paddleball, and I think I played more handball at that time. But I had to stop playing handball when my hand puffed up so much I couldn't even hold a pencil. But sports became important to me, but only at college, not before. I still play racquetball, except for COVID-19. I'm not going to go in one of those tiny courts at 75. So that's, like I say, probably one of the more valuable parts of my undergraduate education. The summer after my first year German course, I worked as a Gastarbeiter, or a guest worker, in Germany. There, my Texas accented German added an Italienische Klang from all the Italian guest workers in the same fabric printing plant that I worked in. Among other things I learned is always draw a spark with your knuckle, not the fingertips, because the fingertips hurt so much more. Printing on this cloth built up enough static electricity that you could easily draw off a 3-inch blue spark. And like I say, you'd rather, it hurt your knuckle too, but it's not as bad as it would your finger tip. After I finished my time at the factory, I hitchhiked all around Europe. I mean, from Norway to Yugoslavia and every place in between. I saw a Viking ship display in Oslo. I saw the Colosseum, the Parthenon, Stonehenge. This was back when you could walk in among the stones at Stonehenge, which you can't do anymore. I didn't chip any piece of it like I did the Berlin Wall decades later. However, there was a downside. I felt more lonesome than I ever have at any other time in my life. Even more so because it was something like an inversion of today's COVID-19 loneliness. I could travel anywhere, and the only mask I had to wear was the constant smile of a hitchhiker. However, I couldn't contact anyone that I loved because we didn't have the amazing connectivity tools of Zoom, of WhatsApp, or FaceTime. So, funny story, I ran out of cash on the French Riviera. Now, it is not nice to be broke in Nice. The American Express that I went to saying, yeah, wire some money to me, I need it right now, explained to me that the money didn't transfer at the speed of light. That actually it took several days for all the paperwork to get handled. Meanwhile, I had no cash and couldn't even sleep in a youth hostel because they're not free. So the American Express recommended the American Consulate, to which I went, and they gave me some money to tide me over, which was wonderful and a great service that our consulates provide to citizens. Foolishly, though, I decided to enjoy the lavish American-style clean bathroom just before closing time. And when I came out, found myself locked in the American consulate. I could get out the front door, but I couldn't lock it behind me. And I really didn't want to leave it in that state. So I went to the bathroom, out a window, and shinnied down the wall. And then just, realized I was inside a high wrought iron fence with spear tips on the top. And I got over that too, and was just glad that no gendarme came by to ask me what the heck I was up to. So that was, there were a number of escapades, but we'll leave it at that. Now, why did I major in physics? Well, I saw it as the underpinning of all science. In fact, in my hubris, I saw chemistry as just a branch of applied physics. So I was, unfortunately, more interested in the humanities courses that I took as an undergraduate at Rice. I really enjoyed a lot of those. But despite that inclination, I continued to study physics for 3 degrees, 1, 2, 3, and a postdoctoral research position. I'm definitely stubborn or just lacking self-insight. In the first part of my life, I experienced the ups and the downs of bipolar disorder without knowing it. Fortunately, my mood swings are now well controlled by the medication that I gladly take every day. I probably showed the first negative effects while I was still in college. Certainly, I was very depressed for long periods, although there was no diagnosis at that time. I don't really know which of the sustained periods of high activity in my life may be explained by periods of mania. You may well wonder if I miss those heady days of feeling that I could do anything. No, I know now that they were artificial and I did some very negative things while I was feeling like Superman. One consequence was that my grades suffered in college such that I was placed on probation the last semester of my senior year. Well, a little known rule was you can't graduate on probation. So I was told that to get a Rice degree, I would have to raise my average and get some grades that were better than the ones I had that last term. So I went across town to the University of Houston and took courses that I liked. I had some very nice courses in music composition, art, including nude sketching, sociology, and molecular biology. By the way, nude sketching does not mean I took all my clothes off and sketched something. I felt much better doing this work instead of the physics I had been doing. The spring after that fall, where I'd gotten off probation and I was able to graduate at the end of the spring, I worked as a computer programmer back in the early days for a medical doctor who was doing research. In fact, he was trying to improve on the lie detector by using EEGs, that's brainwave scans. So I was writing programs that tried to analyze these digital results from the EEG readings, the electrodes placed on the subject's head. And there was a simulation that was involved of a robbery. The simulation involved 3 different individuals, one of whom actually came in and simulated a robbery with a real pistol that was unloaded, and he would point it at the doctor, who would hand over some cash and he would leave. So he had that knowledge that he did that, and his somatic feelings that he had the pistol and he pointed it at the doctor, and all that was in his brain, and I was supposed to detect it or some effect of it. Another level was someone who was totally innocent, didn't even know there'd been a robbery, knew nothing. And the in-between version, called guilty knowledge, was someone who was told a bit about the incident but didn't see it. So my competition was a Texas Ranger who had years of experience with polygraph. So he was looking at a polygraph reading while he asked the questions of the 3 subjects. Just to cut to the chase, his results were always better than mine. I could never match the experience of a Texas Ranger, because, I mean, there's a lot going on there. He's actually looking at the guy and estimating whether he's lying or not. Anyway, yeah, I didn't even get to see him. Darn. I had readouts from electrodes and I wrote programs that looked at how much values went up, went down in voltage, and tried to analyze for significant events that would prove who was guilty and not. And like I say, it was basically a failure, but it was a source of income for me, and that's where I learned my first programming, which formed the basis of much of the rest of my work life. An interesting story, I think I have time to tell side stories, was a tricky incident happened when one of these subjects who was guilty actually cocked the pistol while he was pointing it at the doctor, and that made the doctor very nervous. Now, he knew the pistol was empty, but it's not a good feeling to have someone go to the extra step to pull the hammer back and point it at you. And everybody survived everything, but after that, I think they took the hammers out, or the firing pins. They removed the firing pins just for safety's sake. All right, that was then, okay, the most significant thing out of that period of working in the Texas Medical Center was I met my future wife, Paige. She was a secretary in the same office, and we got to know each other. After I did graduate that spring from Rice University, Paige and I were in Gainesville, Florida, where I studied quantum physics at the University of Florida and received a master's degree. After that, I immediately entered the officer candidate program for the U.S. Navy. And that was a challenging course, which I survived. It's not quite boot camp, but it's intended to remind you of what boot camp is like. During that training, Paige and I watched the first moon landing on a black and white TV. We also went nearby on a weekend to a music festival that I can't remember the name of. It's not the famous one everyone talks about, but it was quite an interesting weekend. So the day after I was commissioned as an ensign in the U.S. Navy, Paige and I were married by the base chaplain. Now, I first had a duty station in Washington, D.C., and that allowed me to understand why all that mess happened in Vietnam, because I was playing squash, it was, in the basement of the Pentagon with an Army colonel. And he cheated. He said that he claimed a point that he had clearly not won. And I knew that he knew that I knew that he was cheating. But he also knew that as an ensign, I wasn't going to call him on it, which I didn't. But at that point, I then fully understood that debacle in Vietnam and why all the lies about lives lost and body bag counts. And it was a total lack of honesty. All right, after the first assignment, I extended my enlistment in order to take an assignment teaching physics at the Naval Academy, which I did for 2 years. I taught the initial level of physics to midshipmen who were far more interested in other courses such as sports or military studies. So I expected too much of them, and I was far too harsh, I now realize. That gave me cause to wonder when, during the summer between the 2 years that I taught, I accompanied the midshipmen on a so-called midshipman cruise across the Atlantic with 2 LSDs, landing ship docks, carrying hundreds of midshipmen. And I was acting as a quartermaster, so I had their paychecks in my cabin safe. But the most interesting moment was when I rode in a bosun's chair from one of the ships to the other, which was held across the water by a line that was tended by a midshipman at each end. And I had to wonder, how many of these midshipmen are students that I gave an F to? But I really didn't need to worry because they were being tended, the midshipmen, by petty officers who were darn sure not going to let an officer get his feet wet because the consequences to them would have been too severe. Since I was at the Naval Academy, I could take any courses there. And I've always had an interest in language. So I took Chinese, Russian, and Japanese just because they were all interesting to me. And it was, and other than teaching my class, I wasn't taking any other classes, so I had the time for it. I tried to organize a visit to the Soviet Union with my fellow Russian students. That didn't happen. The Naval Investigative Service put a stop to that. They explained to me in person and in great detail the risks involved, that although I would think of myself as just another Russian student with the midshipmen, in fact, I would be regarded as the SOP, the Senior Officer Present, therefore responsible for anything that happened. For example, should the KGB be able to compromise one of these young future officers for future turning as some sort of mole. So as I say, that was an interesting visit that I never took. I've actually never been to Russia. When my Navy tour ended, my entire family drove from Annapolis, Maryland to Rice University, where I was continuing my education for a PhD in physics. We drove in our VW bus, which I had painted over from gray to all the colors of the rainbow in various size, in various shapes and sizes, a la the painter Mondrian. It was a very colorful bus. I never saw another one like it. Our first daughter had been born in the Naval Academy Hospital. Our second daughter, the first daughter is named Kelly, and the second daughter is Shay, and she was born in Houston during the doctoral studies. Our two daughters are the best part of those parts of my life, of that part of my life. Another collapse. All four of us moved to Germany for a postdoctoral position I took there after the doctorate, and we all enjoyed living there. The girls attended the local school and they learned to speak German without an accent. I enjoyed riding my bicycle to research through the woods, and then that still contained a bomb crater from World War II. During that postdoctoral work, that was when I recognized that I didn't have a special creative spark for physics. I didn't have the originality or the insight that Einstein or Newton had. Now, I recognize that's an impossible bar. But these were my heroes, and that was the goal that I had set for myself. Now, my work really consisted just of filling in the gaps there were in the physics framework that was existent. Probably I should have been satisfied with just, let's call this, finding the dinosaur bones in the physics field, and it could have been enough. But I decided it wasn't, and we returned home from that living in Germany to move to Rochester, New York, where I joined the Xerox Corporation. At that time, Xerox was still a premier business, perhaps at the peak of its success. The remainder of my 27 years with Xerox, it continued a long decline. I like to think that timing is strictly a coincidence. I was on a list to be laid off within 2 years of being hired by Xerox. After I appealed that successfully, I was constantly aware that my employment was not a permanent thing. It was a bit like a game of musical chairs, and you didn't know when your job position would be removed. So perhaps because of that precariousness, my career at Xerox was very interesting. I was always looking for ways to become more valuable to Xerox and where I should move if my current job was discontinued, which happened a few times. My initial employment was in a group that used mathematical models to determine the optimum conditions for xerographic copying and the printing when that comes along. Yada, yada, yada. My wife, Paige, and I were not happy together. It was at that time that I was diagnosed with bipolar condition. I hoped that reducing the effects of the bipolar condition by influence of medication would help us to resolve our difficulties, but we divorced anyway. I met a fellow musician, Debbie McCullough, on a band trip in Germany. The Monroe County Parks Band was invited to Rochester's sister city, Würzburg, Germany, to participate in a giant garden show. Debbie played the first clarinet part in the Parks Band, and I played the first saxophone. We enjoyed getting to know each other, and we were married in the garden of the First Unitarian Church. At Xerox, I extended my interest in languages to be fonts, which are the character sets, the so-called the letters that are used to print languages. Eventually, I negotiated with a publishing firm in China for the Chinese language fonts used in the Xerox Docutech printer. This led to a fantastic trip to China for both Debbie and me, where we were wined and dined and shown the Great Wall and the Terracotta Warriors in Xi'an. Oh, and Xerox did buy fonts from our hosts. Now, an even greater overseas experience with Xerox was a 2-year expatriate position in Japan. I got an intentionally ill-defined job as an expatriate working with the Xerox affiliate company, Fuji Xerox, half owned by Fujifilm, Kodak's great competitor, and half owned by Xerox. In effect, I became a double agent, working for both sides. Each company was expecting me to give them more information than I gave the other side. It was a diplomatic landmine. However, I never stepped on a landmine, and I managed to keep everyone reasonably satisfied over the 2 years. At the end of the 2 years, it was supposed to be a 3-year appointment, but Xerox got in such financial difficulties, we were called back to save costs. That was exactly January 1st, 2000 that we flew back from Japan. So the Y2K non-event didn't happen while we were in the air between Japan and the US. I'm not exactly sure when, because we crossed about 12 time zones, and I'm not sure when midnight was in the one that we were in at the time. But anyway, nothing happened and the plane did not fall from the sky, I'm happy to say. Running out of time. I did want to say that Debbie really enjoyed being in Japan, where she learned to play several musical instruments. The horizontal zither, the koto, is a beautiful instrument of which she owns 7 or so now. And the shamisen was a 3-string banjo-like instrument that actually both of us played because our neighbor was a teacher. So we would go over there and squat on the floor and sing and play. Got to hurry it up now, looking at the clock. I began teaching physics again while I was still teaching at Xerox. Debbie and I were taking ballroom dancing classes, and the chairman of the physics department at SUNY Brockport was in the same class. So we got to know each other. He invited me to teach out there, which I did for many years. That was the beginning of a 20-year adjunct instructor period, which just ended this month at Finger Lakes Community College. Over that span, I think I may have learned to be a decent teacher. I hope so. But enough about education and employment. There is more to life. What about religion? I was raised in the Presbyterian church by my parents and in the Southern Baptist church by all my other relatives. Now, these denominations are very different. The Presbyterian church is much more cerebral, sort of like the Unitarian church. And the Southern Baptist church appeals to deep emotions. So as a preteen, I confessed my sins and belief in God because I was terrified of hell. And I must admit to some backsliding since that period. Soon after Paige and I moved to Rochester from Germany, we decided that our two daughters were old enough at 6 and 8 to get some background in religion. So we came to the First Unitarian Church. That started an approximate 40-year engagement until this point with the First Unitarian Church. The girls attended religious education. I sang in the choir, taught a youth religious education class. Eventually, I served on the board of trustees. The whole family enjoyed summers at Camp Adirondack in the Adirondacks. And there's another page-turning fallover. After my first marriage ended, I participated in a small group at church called Building Your Own Theology, or BYOT. We were fortunate that the Reverend Dick Gilbert was leading the group using a curriculum that he himself had created. I learned a lot about what I believe, and I received a lot of love and support from that wonderful group. We valued it so much that after the first formal class ended, the group continued without Dick as leader, and we called ourselves BYOT2. It was a very valuable support group. In my second marriage, my wife Debbie was very involved in the Unitarian Church. She led a children's choir, sang in the adult choir, and played in our clarinet choir. Later on, she directed the early service choir, and she sang frequently as a soloist. She sings now with the Universalist Church since our divorce last summer. Recently, I have been introducing myself to new friends as Russell rather than Russ, because I think it's time again to make some changes in myself. Now, I don't expect family and old friends who have known me for decades to make this change. And that's just fine, because it just reminds me of how long we've known each other. So I'm making a new beginning now, and I'm focusing on the good things in the future. That's my story. I'm finished now.